They came from 3 counties to tell her she was a fool. The ruin on the North Mesa was a pile of dead stone. Everyone knew it. Worthless. A heap the ancestors had left to rot, good for nothing but rattlesnakes and bad luck. Men had grazed cattle past it for 40 years and never once turned their heads. But she stood in the middle of that dying valley, in the worst drought any of us had ever seen, with the wells going to dust and the cattle dropping in the draws. And she put her hand flat against those old worthless stones like she was feeling for a heartbeat. And she said, "This isn't a grave, it's a promise. Somebody built it to keep." I laughed at her. God forgive me, I laughed. By the end of that summer, half the men who'd called her a fool were standing at those stones with their hats in their hands. And I'd learned that the most worthless thing in that whole country had been the way we looked at each other. This is the story of a woman named Nita, a ruin everyone had given up on, and the water none of us deserved to find. The last of my good heifers went down at the mouth of Coyote Draw, and I sat on my heels in the dust beside her, and did the only useful thing a man can do at a time like that, which is nothing at all. She wasn't dying pretty, cattle rarely do. Her ribs worked like a broken bellows and her tongue had gone gray, and there wasn't a swallow of water in 11 miles to give her. Because the tank at the home place had cracked to clay 3 weeks back, and I'd been hauling barrels from the Picos until the wagon axle split. And after that, I'd been hauling nothing, which is a hard thing to haul. I took my knife out and I did what needed doing, and I won't set that part down here. Some things a man keeps out of the ledger. That's my habit, understand. I keep a ledger. Little cloth-bound thing my late wife gave me the winter before the fever took her, and I write in it every night whether there's anything worth writing or not, head count, weather, the price of nails, who owes me and who I owe. Callie used to say I'd write down my own funeral if somebody handed me the pencil quick enough. She wasn't wrong. There's a comfort in tallying a thing. Even when the tally's all subtraction, at least you know the size of the hole you're standing in. That June, the hole was about the size of the whole territory. I'd started the spring with 140 head. The morning I'm telling you about, I made a mark in the ledger and the number was 31, and I sat there in the wagon seat with the pencil in my hand, and I did a thing I'm not proud of. I braided a little length of my dead horse's tail hair between my fingers, round and round. I'd cut a hank of it off old Duff when I'd had to put him down in May, and I kept it in my vest, and when the world got past what I could carry, I'd take it out and braid it and unbraid it and braid it again, like a fool telling beads. My hands do it when my head can't. I've never told a living soul that, and I don't know why I'm telling you. So I'll say it plain. The morning I met Nita, I was a man at the bottom of his rope, braiding a dead horse's tail on a wagon seat, on my way to the one piece of my land that had never given me a thing. The North Mesa. You've got to understand what that ruin was to us, or none of the rest will land right. Up on the flat of the mesa sat a spread of old stone, walls half fallen, laid up dry without mortar, some of it worn down to knee-height and some of it still standing 2 men tall, all of it the color of the country, which is to say the color of old blood and older bone. The ancestors built it. Not the Apache, not exactly, the old ones, the ones who'd been in that country when the mountains were younger, whoever they were. Long gone before my grandfather's grandfather. My whole life folks called it the Worthless Heap. That was the polite name. Cowhands wouldn't camp near it. Said it was bad luck, said the wind came through the stones at night sounding like people talking low, said a man who slept up there came down changed. Preachers didn't like it. Cattle wouldn't graze it, which everybody blamed on the ghosts, and nobody blamed on the fact that not one blade of grass grew inside those walls. Even the drought hadn't killed the grass up there. There'd never been grass up there to kill. I was going up because I'd run out of anywhere else to go. There was an old story that the heap had a seep in it somewhere, a wet place, and I didn't believe it any more than I believed in the ghosts, but a man with 31 head and no water will chase a story he doesn't believe. That's just arithmetic. I came up the cattle trail switchback in the wagon, and I topped out onto the flat, and there was a woman standing in the middle of the ruin with her hand on the wall. I hadn't seen her ride in. There was no horse. There was just her, in a faded blue trade-cloth dress with a man's canvas coat over it against the morning, and her black hair going gray at the temple gathered back off a face that had been out in the weather a long, long time. Apache. I knew that much at a glance the way you know weather. Chiricahua I'd learn later, though there weren't supposed to be any left in that country by then. They'd been shipped off to Florida years before, packed onto trains like cordwood, and the ones who weren't dead were 1,000 miles from home in a swamp they'd never asked to see. That she was standing on that mesa at all was a small impossibility I didn't have the sense to wonder about yet. She didn't startle when my wheels crunched the caliche. She just kept her hand on the stone, palm flat. Fingers spread, her eyes were shut. "Ma'am," I said, because I didn't know what else a man says. She opened her eyes, but she didn't take her hand off the wall. She looked at me the way you'd look at a horse you weren't sure was broke, not afraid, just taking my measure, deciding how much room to give me. "This is your land," she said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an apology. English, clear as a bell, with a shape to the words that wasn't mine. "Deeded and taxed," I said, "for all the good it's done me." I climbed down, my knees told me about it. "You lost." She almost smiled at that. "No," she said, "you are," and she turned back to the stone. Now I'll tell you the truth, I was in a temper. I'd killed a heifer at daybreak, and I hadn't slept, and I had a dead horse's hair in my vest, and a stranger was standing on the one useless corner of my ruined kingdom telling me I was lost, and I opened my mouth to run her off it. But she spoke before I could. "Your cattle are dying," she said, still not looking at me. "Down there in the low places, I heard them in the night." "Whole country's dying," I said. "You come up here to tell me the news." "I came up here," she said, and now she did turn, and she put her back against the wall and folded her arms and looked at me. "Because this is the only place for 2 days' walk that isn't dead, and you have never once come to see why." That stopped me, I'll own it stopped me. Because she was right, and I'd never thought about it, and the not thinking about it was suddenly a strange and shameful thing. Everything below the mesa was cracked to powder. The cottonwoods along the draws had dropped their leaves in June like it was October. But up here I truly looked, maybe for the first time in my life. Up here there was a green nobody talked about. Low stuff, ground-hugging, dusty, but green. A little cottonwood, no taller than a boy, growing up out of a fallen corner of the ruin where no tree had any business being. Green. "There's a seep," I said slowly. "The old-timers said." "There is no seep." She said it flat, almost hard. Then something in her face gentled the way a hand gentles on a rope. "A seep is an accident, water finding a crack. This," she rapped her knuckles on the wall, one soft knock like knocking on a door, "is not an accident. Nothing here is an accident. Every stone in this place was carried up that hill on a person's back and set down for a reason, and the reason is still working. You have lived under it your whole life, and you called it worthless." "Folks call it the worthless heap," I admitted. "That's a fact." "Folks," she said, and the way she said it put a whole sermon into the one word, "are often wrong about what is worth keeping." I want to tell you I understood her right off. I didn't. What I understood was that I was tired and thirsty and outnumbered by a woman standing alone. So I did the small, mean thing a cornered man does. I asked her for her papers, more or less. I asked what she was doing off the reservation, whether she had leave, whether somebody knew where she was, asked it in that flat official voice we all learned to use, the voice that turns a person into a problem. She let me finish. She had a great gift for letting a man finish so that he could hear how he sounded. "My grandmother helped build the check walls in the canyon below this place," she said when I'd run down. "When I was a girl, she brought me here and put my hand on this stone, the way I put mine now, and she told me what it was for. Then the soldiers came and we were sent to a wet country far away where my grandmother died coughing, and my mother died coughing, and a great many people I loved died coughing, and I did not." She said it evenly, the way you'd read a list off a ledger, and that evenness was worse than tears would have been. "Last year they let a few of us come back to New Mexico. Not here, a different place with a fence around it. But I am old and I walk where I want, and before I die I wanted to stand once more where my grandmother put my hand." She looked at the wall, then at me. "I did not come to steal your worthless heap, cattleman. I came to keep a promise. You may run me off it if you like. It is your land, deeded and taxed." I stood there with the sun climbing and the dead heifer's blood still under my nails, and I did not run her off. I want to say it was decency. I've had years to be honest about it, and I think it was mostly that little green cottonwood growing where no tree should grow. I think it was the arithmetic again. A man with 31 head does not walk away from the only green thing in the county. "What was it for?" I said. "The wall, your grandmother's wall." And for the first time she smiled all the way, and it took 20 years off her. and I understood she'd been waiting the whole conversation to be asked a real question instead of a suspicious one. "Come," she said. "I'll show you what your grandfathers never learned to see." She led me not into the ruin, but around it, out to the north rim of the mesa where the flat broke off into a shallow, rock-clipped basin, a natural bowl in the stone, wide as a corral, that I'd ridden past 100 times and never once looked into. And I looked into it now, and I saw that it wasn't natural at all. Or it had started natural, and then someone had finished it. All along the low lip, where rain would want to run off and be lost down the mesa side into the desert, someone had laid up a curve of those same dry-set stones, knee-high patient so that the water couldn't leave. And leading down from the basin, cut into the living rock and half-choked now with a century of blown dirt, ran a channel. A ditch, but older than any ditch I knew. It ran down toward the ruin and disappeared under the fallen stone, going somewhere I couldn't see. "They did not build a village here," Nita said, standing on the rim with the hot wind pulling at her gray-streaked hair. "There is no water to drink up here and no soil to plant. Why would people carry 10,000 stones up a hill to live where there is nothing?" She let that sit. "They did not build a house. They built a hand, to catch the rain, to hold it, to carry it down and put it away in the dark where the sun could not steal it back." She looked at me. "There is a great deal of water in this country, cattleman. There has always been a great deal of water. It falls in 1 week, and it is gone in 1 day because no one taught the land to keep it. My grandmother's people taught this one hill to keep it, and your people looked at the teaching and called it a worthless heap. I stood on that rim a long time. Down below me, 3 miles south and 1,100 feet down, my valley was turning to bone. My cattle were dying in the draws. My well was clay. And I was standing next to 100 years of blown dirt that a woman was telling me had water sleeping under it, water her people had put away in the dark on purpose before my grandfather was born. I took out my ledger. I don't know why. Habit, I said. When my head can't hold a thing, my hands do something. I opened it to a clean page, and I stood there with the pencil not writing, because for once in my life I did not know how to tally what was in front of me. There was no column for it. "You don't believe me," Nita said, not angry, just naming it. "I believe you believe it," I said, which was honest and cowardly both. She nodded slowly, like that was about what she'd expected from a man like me. Then she walked down off the rim to where the old channel disappeared under the fallen stone, and she knelt, and she began to move rock. Not fast, not desperate. 1 stone set aside. Another set aside. An old woman clearing 100 years of drift with her bare hands in the heat, patient as water itself, because she had walked all the way back from a swamp in Florida to a fence in New Mexico, and then off the fence and across 2 days of dead country to keep a promise to a grandmother who died coughing. And she was not about to be stopped now by a pile of dirt or by the doubt of a cattleman who called her people's genius a heap. I watched her for a while. My hands found the horsehair in my vest and started braiding. Then I put the ledger away, and I got the shovel out of the wagon, and I went and knelt down beside her, and I started to dig. She glanced at me sidelong, didn't thank me. I'd have thought less of her if she had. "What's your name?" I asked, working. She told me. Then she told me what the settlers up in the valley had shortened it to when she was young, before the trains, Nita. And she said I could use that one, since my mouth wasn't shaped for the true one, and she said it kindly enough that it didn't sting. "And you?" she asked. "Elias," I said. "Elias Crane." "Well, Elias Crane," she said, lifting a stone that must have weighed 30 pounds and setting it aside like it was bread. "You have wasted 40 years. Let us not waste the afternoon." We dug until the light went red, and a little before dark, 6 feet down that old choked channel, my shovel struck something that was not dirt and was not the natural rock of the mesa. It was flat. It was worked. It was set stone, laid by hands, sloping down and away into the dark of the hill. A made floor, a made passage going in. Nita went very still beside me. She reached down and laid her palm flat against the buried stone, fingers spread, the way she'd touched the wall that morning, the way her grandmother had once pressed her small girl's hand and told her what it was for. "Hello," she said softly to the hill, to the dark, to the dead, to the promise. I came back. And out of the black seam my shovel had opened. Cool against the hot red evening came a breath of air. Damp air. I have dug post holes and graves and root cellars, and once, God help me, a well that went 90 feet and came up dry, and I know the smell of dirt in all its moods. Dirt has 100 smells, and 99 of them are dust. The 100th is the one that came up out of that seam in the last light of the day, and it was the smell of a cellar, of a spring house, of the underside of a creek stone when you turn it over. It was the smell of water that has never seen the sun, and a man who has been hauling his thirst around for 3 months does not mistake it for anything else. I didn't sleep at the home place that night. I made a camp right there on the mesa, 30 feet from the ruin the whole country called worthless, and I lay on my back in my bedroll and listened to the wind come low through the old stones. And I understood, finally, why the cowhands said it sounded like people talking. It did. It sounded exactly like people talking low in another room, on the far side of a wall you can't quite see, 100 years of them, 1,000, murmuring in a language nobody up in the valley had ever bothered to learn. I used to think that sound was a haunting. That night I understood it was only a conversation I'd been rude enough to ignore my whole life. Nita slept sitting up against the wall, wrapped in her canvas coat, and I don't think she slept much either. We were 3 days getting into the hill. I won't lay out every shovelful, a ledger's a ledger, but even I know when to stop counting. What matters is what the passage turned out to be. It sloped down into the mesa at the gentle grade of the old channel, floored and walled in that same dry-laid stone, and it did not go far before it opened up. Into a room. A made room in the heart of the hill, round as a granary and twice as tall as a man, corbelled up overhead in a dome of stacked flat stones that had held their weight through 100 years of nobody, through earthquakes for all I know, through the settling of the whole tired world. And the floor of that room sloped down to a rim, a lip of smooth-set stone, and past the rim was black, and past the black, when I held my lantern down over it and my own breath came back at me cool and wet, was water. A cistern, a tank in the living heart of the mesa. Fed by the basin up top, carried down the channel we'd cleared, poured into the dark and kept there out of the reach of the sun that steals everything in that country. Low, after 100 years and a 3-year drought, but there. Black and still and deeper than my lantern light could find the bottom of. I dropped a pebble and the plunk of it came back up out of the dark, and I swear to you I sat down on the cold stone floor and I put my face in my hands. And I am not a weeping man, and I do not care to describe what I did there in the dark of that hill, except to say that Nita let me finish. She always let a man finish. Your grandmothers, I said when I could talk, they built this. With their backs, she said, with their whole lives. So that in a year like this one, no one below would have to watch their children go thirsty. She looked at the black water and her jaw was tight. And your people came and grazed their cattle over the top of it and never asked what it was and called it worthless because it was not shaped like the thing you would have built. There wasn't anything to say to that. She wasn't wrong. I'd been 50 years on that land and I'd called it the worthless heap same as everybody. I wrote in the ledger that night, first real entry in a week. I wrote, found water on North Mesa, not a seep. A made tank old as the country. She was right and we were all wrong. And then, because a ledger's a place for the truth or it's nothing, I wrote a line I've never crossed out. A whole people knew how to live on this land and we killed them for it and grazed cows on their genius. God forgive us. I don't see why he should. Here's the thing about good news in a poor country, though. It doesn't stay yours. Word got up the valley the way word does. One of my hands rode up to see why I hadn't been at the home place, and he saw the dig, and he saw the wet dirt, and he saw the Apache woman. And by the time I'd have wanted to control the story was 3 counties wide and out of my hands entirely, and it had grown horns and a tail in the traveling. The version that reached town was this. Crane had gone soft in the drought, taken up with a runaway squaw off the reservation, and the 2 of them were digging up ghost gold in the ruins. I'm sorry for the word. It's the word they used. I set it down because prettying it up would be its own kind of lie. Harlan Voss rode up on the 5th day. You've got a Harlan Voss in every county. Biggest spread, biggest voice, first pew on Sunday and first to foreclose on Monday. His land ringed mine on 3 sides, and he'd been wanting the 4th, mine, for a decade, at his price, which was a widower's desperation price, which the drought had been kindly bringing around to. He came up the switchback with 3 of his riders, and he sat his big blood-bay horse at the edge of my dig, and he looked down into the passage, and he looked at Nita, and I watched him do the arithmetic that men like Voss do, which is the fastest and coldest arithmetic in the world. Well, he said, Elias, here you struck water. Heard right, I said. On the heap. He said it wonderingly, like a man being told a joke had turned out true. The worthless heap. He swung down. He was a big man, and he moved easy for it. He walked to the mouth of the passage and looked down into the dark, and I saw him smell the damp of it, saw his whole face change the way a coyote's changes when the wind brings it the smell of a henhouse. How much? Enough, I said, for my stock. For the valley, run careful. Maybe for a lot of years, run careful. The valley, Voss said and smiled. Sure, the valley. He turned around and looked at Nita, who had gone still against the wall the way she went still, arms folded, taking his measure the way she'd taken mine. This the one built it. Her grandmothers built it, I said, before any of us. Uh-huh. Voss walked toward her. Slow. The three riders shifted their horses without being told, a small, ugly ballet, the horses stepping to close the ground between Nita and the switchback, between Nita and any way down off that mesa that didn't go through Voss. I saw it. She saw it before I did. So the way I hear it, Voss said, easy, reasonable, the voice of a man explaining the weather, is there's a runaway off the Mescalero agency been trespassing on Crane land, which being neighborly is my concern too. And there's found water, which under the territorial code goes to the man that holds the deed, or he let it hang, gentle as a noose, the man that comes to hold it. And there's a dead-broke widower who's about 1 bad month from selling out. Now, he spread his big hands, all reason. I'm not an unfeeling man, Elias. Sell me the north section, water and all, at a fair drought price, and I'll see the whole valley watered proper, through my ditches, on my terms, for a fair fee. And the woman I'll see back to the agency safe, no charges, no fuss. He smiled at Nita like he'd offered her something. That's a Christian offer, all told. It was, if you understand, a very good trap. He was offering to save the valley, which was true, he could. He had the money to do it. And all it would cost was my land, Nita's freedom, and the small matter of a whole people's water passing forever into the hands of the kind of man who'd called them savages for building it. And here's the part I have to set down plain, because it's the part I'm least proud of, and it's the reason there's a story worth telling at all. I thought about it. God help me by, I stood there with 31 head dying below me and a mortgage I couldn't carry and a coffin's worth of debt, and Voss was offering me a way out, and for the space of about 10 heartbeats I did the coward's arithmetic and it came out in his favor. Sell, take the money. Let the valley get watered on Voss's terms, water's water, isn't it? Let the woman go back behind her fence. She'd been behind a fence her whole life, hadn't she? One more wouldn't kill her. 10 heartbeats. I'll carry those 10 heartbeats to my grave. Then Nita spoke. Not to me, to Voss. You would put a gate on the rain, she said quietly. You would take the one thing my grandmother's made so that no child would ever have to beg for water, and you would make the whole valley beg you for it. For a fee, she didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. You call that Christian? I call it business, Voss said, and his easiness thinned a little because she'd seen him clean through and he knew it. You're a long way from anyone who'd miss you, old woman. I'd think careful about your tone. And there it was, out loud, the threat with its coat off. My hands were in my vest. I hadn't even felt them go there. Braiding, round and round that dead horse's hair, while a big man threatened an old woman on a hill her people had died building. I want to tell you I had a fine speech. I didn't. What I had was the ledger. I took it out. Old cloth-bound thing, my dead wife's gift, the tally of my whole small, ruined life. And I opened it to the page I'd written that night in the dark, and I read it out loud, right there on the mesa in front of Voss and his 3 riders and Nita and the murmuring stones. I read the head count and the weather, and then I read the last 2 lines, the ones I'd never crossed out. A whole people knew how to live on this land, and we killed them for it and grazed cows on their genius. And the other one, about God, about why he should forgive us. I read it in a flat cattleman's voice to a man who'd never once wondered whether he needed forgiving. Then I shut the book. The north section's not for sale, Harlan, I said. Not the water, not the woman, not the heap. My voice wasn't steady, and I let it not be steady. You want to water this valley, you can come up here hat in hand like the rest of us and ask her how it's done. That's the fee. That's the only fee there's going to be. Voss looked at me for a long moment, and he wasn't angry, which was the frightening part. He was disappointed, the way a man's disappointed in a tool that broke. You always were sentimental, he said. That's why you're broke. He nodded to his riders and swung back up on the blood bay, and he looked down at the 2 of us from up there, and he said the thing I've thought about every day since. Water like that up on a hill and only 2 people that know how to work it. That's a fragile kind of a fortune, Elias. He gathered his reins. Fragile things break. And they rode down the switchback, unhurried, and the last I saw of them that day was the dust hanging red in the low sun long after the men were gone. Nita let out a breath I hadn't known she was holding. "You read your book to him?" she said. There might have been the ghost of a smile in it. "That was a strange weapon." "It's the only one I've got that he can't buy," I said. She was quiet. "Then he will come back." "I know it." "Not for the water," she said, and she looked down the switchback where the dust was settling, and her weathered face was grim in a way it hadn't been even when she talked about the trains and the swamp and her grandmother dying. "Men like that never come back for the water. They come back for the two people who know how to work it. Because water any fool can steal, but knowing that he cannot buy and cannot steal and cannot bear that anyone has who is not him." She turned and put her hand flat on the old wall, fingers spread, and shut her eyes, and I understood she was doing arithmetic of her own, older and colder than Voss's. "He will wait for a night with no moon," she said, "and he will make it look like the dark did it, like the hill did it. Like the ghosts everyone always said, we're up here finally took the fools who dug too deep." The wind came low through the stones, murmuring, and for the first time it did not comfort me. "Then we don't wait for him," I said. "We get the valley up here first. Every family, every hand, everyone he'd have to answer to. He can't disappear 2 people if 200 people know what they know." I was already braiding, already tallying, the arithmetic running hot now, and for once in my life it was addition. "You said the fee for the water is that they come and ask you how it's done, so we make him need a lot of witnesses. We teach the whole valley the thing your grandmothers knew. Tomorrow, in the daylight, loud." Nita opened her eyes and looked at me, and there was something in her face I hadn't earned and knew it. "You would give my grandmother's knowledge to the whole valley," she said slowly, "to the same people who called it worthless. You would make it so common that Voss cannot own it, by making it so shared that no one can." "Yes. And in doing that," she said, watching me close, "you make it no longer only ours, it becomes everyone's. The last thing my people made on this land, the last thing that is only ours, handed out to the valley like water from a bucket." Her voice didn't break, but it thinned the way a rope thins where it's fraying. "You are asking me to give away the last thing." I hadn't thought of it that way. God forgive me, I hadn't. I'd been so pleased with my clever plan to save her that I hadn't seen the cost I was asking her to pay to be saved. I put the ledger away. "No," I said, "I'm not asking you anything. It's yours. All of it's yours, the water, the knowing, the choice. You walked here from Florida to keep a promise. You get to say what happens to it, and I'll stand with you either way, and if you say we hold it close and take our chances with Voss and the dark of the moon, then that's what we'll do, and I'll dig your grave and mine right here if it comes to it." I meant it. That was the frightening thing. Standing there, I found I meant it all the way down. But if it were mine to say, and it isn't, I'd say the finest revenge on a man who calls a thing worthless is to prove it's worth everything, out loud, to everyone forever. So that 100 years from now some child in this valley turns a tap and doesn't even know to thank you, because it's just how things are done here. Just the water. Just how we live. Nita stood a long time with her hand on the stone. The sun went all the way down while she decided. The first stars came out hard and white the way they do in dry country. Somewhere below us in the dark a cow bawled, thirsty, dying, one of my last 31. "My grandmother," Nita said at last, very quiet, "did not put my hand on this stone so that I could keep it in the dark." She took a breath. "She put my hand on it so that I would know how to give it away." She turned to me and her eyes were wet and her voice was steady, and I have never in my life seen anything braver than an old woman deciding to hand a cruel valley the one thing it did not deserve. "Bring them up," she said. "All of them, in the daylight, loud." A pause. "Let us make me the last one who has to keep this secret." I rode down off that mesa in the dark to raise the valley, with a dead horse's hair braided tight around my fingers, and behind me the stones murmured low, and for the first time in 100 years, someone living was answering them back. They came in the end because they were thirsty. I'd like to tell you they came because their hearts changed, but I've kept a ledger too long to sell you that. Thirst is the great persuader. A man who won't cross the road to hear a sermon will cross a desert to reach a well. I rode all that night and half the next day, home place to home place, waking families out of their dust-choked sleep. Some of them shut the door in my face. The Petrys did, and the old Holly's widow, and a couple others who'd heard the town version and wanted no part of ghost gold and runaway squaws. But most of them had children, and the children had gone quiet in the way children go quiet when there isn't enough water, which is a quiet no parent can bear for long. And so most of them came. Wagons and buckboards and folks on foot, up the switchback in the white morning, 40 families, 60, more than I could tally, strung out along the mesa trail like a funeral that had gotten the direction wrong and was climbing toward a berth instead. And Nita met them at the top. I had worried writing down about how it would go, an Apache woman, alone, handing hard truths to a valley of people who'd been raised to fear and despise her kind. I needn't have worried. She had a gift I've never seen the equal of. She didn't scold them and she didn't beg them. She took them, family by family, out to the rim of the North Basin, and she put their hands, grown men's hands, farm wives' hands, children's small hands, flat against the old stone the way her grandmother had once pressed hers. And she said to each of them some version of the same thing. Feel that. That's not a dead thing. That's 100 years of somebody thinking about you before you were born. And then she taught them. She taught them the basin, and the channel and the choke of 100 years of dirt, and how to clear it and keep it clear. She taught them the cistern in the heart of the hill, and how it filled, and how to draw from it without fouling it, and how to know its level, and never take more than the rain put back. She had them dig Voss's own neighbors, sweating in the sun, clearing the old ditches her grandmothers had cut, and as they dug she told them the rest of it, the parts that weren't about this one hill. How the land held water everywhere if you'd only teach it to. How a check dam of stacked stone in the right draw could turn a flood that ran off in a day into a seep that ran for a season. How her people had lived in that country for longer than anyone could count, not by fighting the dry, but by making friends with the little water there was and never once letting it feel unwelcome. It went into their hands over 3 days, the whole drowned genius of it, and it was the finest and most terrible thing I ever watched, because I knew what it was costing her to pour it out. She was emptying herself, handing over the last thing. Every family that walked back down that switchback carried a piece of her grandmother's promise, and Nita stood a little more hollow each evening for the giving of it. And each evening she looked lighter too, the way a person looks when they've set down a load they'd carried too far. On the third night, the cottonwood in the fallen corner of the ruin, the little green one, no taller than a boy, had 100 people camped around it. And there were cook fires up on the worthless heap for the first time in the history of anyone, and children asleep against the old walls, and not one soul was afraid of the ghosts, because the ghosts, it turned out, had only ever been trying to tell us where the water was. Voss didn't come on a night with no moon. He was smarter than that, and Nita, who'd expected the coward's version of him, had underestimated the businessman's. He didn't come with riders in the dark. He came in broad day, with a lawyer from the territorial capital and a sheaf of papers and a surveyor, and he stood at the bottom of the switchback where the whole valley could see, and he made his case in that reasonable, weather-explaining voice, and his case was this: that found water on deeded land was a matter for the courts, that a claim would be filed, that until it was settled, no man could lawfully draw from the North Mesa without risking the trespass of a felony. And that he, Harlan Voss, being a man of means, was prepared to litigate the matter for as many years as it took, which everyone understood meant longer than a poor valley could stay thirsty. He hadn't come to steal the water, he'd come to freeze it. To wrap it in law so tight that we'd all come to him on our knees just to be allowed to drink what was already ours. Because he'd been right, up on the mesa. Water any fool can steal, but knowing he couldn't bear, and if he couldn't own the knowing, by God, he'd put a padlock on the water and make us thank him for the key. And it would have worked. I want you to understand that. Against 40 broke families and one old woman off the agency, Harlan Voss and a capital lawyer and the whole slow machine of territorial law. That would have worked, the way it had always worked, the way it worked on Nita's people when the soldiers came with their own papers and their own reasonable voices and put a whole nation on a train. It would have worked, except for what Nita did. She came down off the mesa, alone, on foot, gray hair loose in the wind, and she walked up to Voss and his lawyer in front of the whole waiting valley, and she did not argue the law, because she knew, none better, that the law had never once been on her side and never would be. She handed the lawyer a piece of paper. I'd helped her write it 2 nights before by firelight with my ledger open for the spelling. I hadn't understood writing it what she meant to do. I understood now. It was a deed of gift. On it, in my hand and signed with her mark and witnessed by 60 families, Nita gave away every scrap of what she knew. Not to me, not to the valley, To all of it, to the territory, to the record, to the public, and forever. The basin, the channel, the cistern, the method, the whole drowned genius of her grandmother's, written down plain enough for a child to follow and dedicated. In language the capital lawyer went pale reading, to the common and perpetual use of any person who thirsted, on any land, without fee, without leave, without end. You cannot litigate a gift already given to everyone. You cannot padlock a thing that has been handed, in writing, witnessed, to the whole world at once. Voss could claim the water in my cistern, maybe, and fight me for it for years. But the knowing, how to make the land keep its rain, how to build the hand that catches the sky, that she had just poured out past any wall he could ever build around it. It was in 60 families' hands and on the territorial record, and it was never, ever coming back. She'd made herself worthless to him, on purpose. She'd given away the last thing so completely that there was nothing left to steal, and in the giving she had made it worth everything, out loud, to everyone, forever, exactly as I'd set up on the mesa, not knowing what I was asking her to spend to do it. Voss read her face and understood he'd lost, and being the man he was, he didn't rage. He just did his cold, fast arithmetic one final time and found no profit in it and put his papers away and rode off. I never did him the honor of hating him properly. He wasn't worth the room in the ledger. The valley lived. I'll tell you that much plain because you've earned it, and so has she. The rains that fall in that country in one hard week no longer run off in one day. There are stacked stone check dams and a dozen draws now that a dozen families built with their own hands from what she taught them, and the cottonwoods have come back green along the washes, and the North Mesa has a proper name on the county maps at last. An Apache name, the true one, the one my mouth was never shaped for. Children turn a valve down in the valley and drink cold water out of the dark heart of a hill and do not know to thank anyone, because it's just how things are done there now. Just the water, just how they live. Which is what she wanted, exactly precisely what she wanted. Nita didn't stay to see the cottonwoods come back. She'd walked all the way from a fence in New Mexico to keep a promise to a grandmother who died coughing, and she'd kept it. And a person who has finally set down a load they carried that far does not want to stand around admiring the empty spot where it used to be. She stayed through the first good rain. I'll give you that. She stayed for that. And I watched her stand out in it on the rim of the basin with her face turned up and her arms a little away from her sides. And I did not go out to her, because some rain a person needs to stand in alone. And a few mornings after, she was gone. No goodbye. She wasn't a goodbye kind of person, and I'd have thought less of her for it. Just gone off down the mesa trail on foot the way she'd come, back toward whatever fence they'd let her live behind, or maybe not back to any fence at all. I never did learn, and I've made my peace with not learning, mostly. She left one thing. I found it on the flat stone at the mouth of the passage, the one we'd struck with the shovel that first red evening, the made floor that had breathed damp air up at us out of the dark. She'd left a little braided length of horsehair. Mine, she must have watched me at it all those weeks, the tell I never told a soul, my hands doing the thing my head couldn't. She must have picked up a strand I'd dropped. She'd braided it herself, tight and even better than I ever did, and coiled it careful on the cold stone where the damp came up. I didn't understand it at first. I stood there a long while turning it over. Then I did understand, and I sat down on the cold floor of that hill with the water sleeping black below me. And I did the thing I'll not describe, the thing I did the first time, and Nita wasn't there to let me finish. And I finished anyway, alone, the way you finish everything in the end. She'd been telling me it was all right to set it down. The dead horse, the dead wife, the 40 wasted years, the 10 heartbeats up on the mesa when I'd almost taken Voss's money. She'd seen that too, I think. She saw everything, all of it. The whole load a man carries braided round his fingers because his head can't hold it. She'd taken the tell I was most ashamed of, and made it into something even and finished, and left it in the one place in all that country where a thing could be kept cool and safe, and out of the reach of the sun that steals everything. Put it away in the dark, she was saying, where it'll keep. I kept the ledger up after. Head count whether the price of nails. The number climbed back up out of the low 30s over the years, the way numbers will when there's water, and there were good seasons and hard ones, and I filled that little cloth book and started another, and I'm an old man now, and I've filled a shelf of them. But I never crossed out those 2 lines, the ones about a whole people who knew how to live on this land, the ones about God and why he should forgive us. I don't know that he has, I don't know that he should. But there's a cottonwood grown tall now over a made floor in the heart of a hill, everyone once called worthless. And there's cold water in the dark that a valley's children drink without knowing whose whole life bought it for them. And there's a braid of horsehair on a stone down there that I go and sit beside sometimes when the load gets past what an old man's hands can carry. And the wind still comes low through those old walls at night, murmuring, the way the cowhands always said, like people talking quiet in the next room. I know better now than to call it a haunting. It was only ever somebody,